Hello everybody, and welcome back to Off Meta Talk, where I answer your questions about Warcry, wargaming in general, and a whole bunch of other things besides. If you have any questions for me around any of that, slap it down in the comments section below, and I will get onto that for a future edition. But yeah, today, let's get going. Let's hear your questions. First question here is from Hero Stroud. How would you fix counter? I appreciate it as a mechanic. It helps with the problem of ganking unactivated models, but it really seems to be overly punishing for weaker models attempting to punch up. I've actually given this a lot of thought, and I've been looking back through a whole bunch of my recordings, recording the dice rolls and seeing what the effect of other potential counter options might be. The one that I think was most promising was actually suggested by our man Charles, and Charles had the idea of, okay, if instead of counter doing all of this damage, what if counter only did 1 damage if you roll any hits, and 2 damage if you roll any crits. So the maximum amount of damage that counter could possibly do, no matter how many dice you're rolling, is basically 3 damage. I find that interesting. I feel like 3 damage is a nice amount of damage to be able to reflect back, especially if your fighter has a generally low damage profile by itself. Maybe it's a 2-attack guy punching up on 5s, something like that. But it's not a ridiculously stupid amount of damage that we see where if you've got 6 attacks and strength 3, you're wounding something on 5s, you're going to take 6, 7, 8 damage back. So I looked into a whole bunch of my past recordings and my past games, listed up everything, and did a comparison between what counter would look like if it were under that rule and what it kind of looks like at the moment. And you can see it's actually pretty favorable. What I feel about counter is that normally it's fine. If it's doing like 2 damage back or 3 damage back, it's kind of okay. The problem is when you spike real high and you have to either attack with a lot of attacks into very high toughness, or your dice just fall flat and you roll a whole bunch of misses, your opponent counters, and they get a whole bunch of free damage on you. This change I think really helps. I kind of like it. So yeah, that's what I would go for. 1 damage for all your misses and 2 damage for all of your crit misses. Simon Grodens asks, if the Gnarlwood was the 2nd edition of Warcry, then what would you like to see in the 3rd? I guess we're talking about setting here. It looks like Age of Sigmar, like Bigmar, has gone over to Ashqui, the realm of fire. That would be interesting, I guess, but considering that Warcry, yeah, there's been more of a push to make it a more competitive game with the updates and with all of the different things that we've been seeing with mission packs, tournament packs, that kind of thing. Considering all of that, I still think that Warcry, people like the narrative side of Warcry, and they want to see a kind of complete arc to what we've been doing. So we started in the Gnarlwood, all the different camps. We saw Scales of Talaxis, so we finally got to the ship. All sorts of Seraphon ruins in that set, so that's really, really cool. And then what I wanted to see going into 3rd edition was inside the crashed ship, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a full catacomb style. You can still do all sorts of Seraphon architecture. These ships are massive. They've got huge like rainforests inside. They've got spawning pools. They've got all sorts of things. So you could really hammer down on that Seraphon and on that old one style of architecture and make some really interesting boards out of that. Maybe with some giant roots that have been digging their way into the ship. The Realm Shaper engine on that ship is also supposed to be going haywire, so inside the ship, who knows what has been going on. There's like corrupted spawning pools that you talked about in the background. So that's where I would want us to see going into 3rd edition. I think that'd be more interesting than just going, oh yeah, you guys were in Gur last time, but we're not in Gur anymore, we're over here. Joe Feldake asks, when is it the right time to use the wait action? I feel like I would always prioritize a double move for my chaff units over wait, then move. The answer to this is, it depends, really. It depends on what your opponent's doing. It depends on what you are doing. Generally speaking, if you outnumber your opponent, you're looking to get as much activation advantage as possible, and you're trying to make your opponent almost waste their moves or see what moves your opponent is going to do before you make moves of your own. So once you've seen what they are doing, you'll be able to make better moves and then react, move in with your fighters, and then attack into other fighters that have already been activated, go and get pieces of treasure that are unguarded, that kind of thing. So that's what we're primarily going to be using the wait action for. We're going to use it so that it either forces your opponent to wait themselves to see what you're going to do, or they activate one of their fighters, and suddenly you've still got half activation to go. You haven't activated any of your important fighters, and you can just carry on playing from there. Especially if you're playing a much larger warband than your opponent. Let's say you're playing 8 fighters on 9, and they're playing 6. A single wait action means that you'll be almost 4 actions ahead of your opponent in terms of they finished doing what they're doing. Now you can do everything that you want to do. So it depends entirely on the board state, it depends on what's going on, but the idea is that you use wait on your chaff models so that it gives time and space for your big models to do what they want to do once you've seen what exactly your opponent is doing. Hero Shroud also asks, are allies more hindrance than help? It seems like so many weaker crews are getting their power pulled much higher by the addition of those few models seen in so many lists, like Calthea Zandire. So is it preventing the crew itself getting some needed buffs? I think when we're talking about buffs, it's very important to kind of split out the two things that we've got going on here, right? We've got the ally making the warband better, and then the warband itself and how the ally works within that warband. Considering that we've only got really one major update that we can look at from that perspective, I would say that it looks like at least what Games Workshop is doing is looking at the warband's internal balance and taking that over different builds with allies. Because it's very easy to make a very strong warband if you throw a whole bunch of allies in, but making a warband by itself good is a lot harder depending on the style of warband that you're playing. But then again, you see that Games Workshop also has an idea that, okay, here are these fighters that are used as allies. We're talking about things like Fulmroid Crushers, a lot of those big 4-8 damage profile fighters that were hit in the April update. I'm pretty sure that the whole reason that they were hit is that they could be used as ubiquitous allies to get those stats in. And Games Workshop seemed to hit those guys specifically over some of the other fighters. Now, some of the other fighters were, of course, hit. Things like Annihilators, right? They went up from 130 to 140 points. Annihilators only come in Thunderstrike Stormcast. But what it looks like, at least from that update, is that they were taking allies separately from the actual warbands. They had targeted hits to specific warbands, and they had targeted hits to specific allies. I like to think that they're keeping an eye on things, and that they are looking at the most common allies that are played. You can see that now Wartally is doing MetaWatch reports that will tell you the most common allies in all of the different Grand Alliances, and those are really good targets for very targeted hits to try and bring some of those other fighters up. But then on the other side, what Games Workshop can see now with all of the data that's coming in, with all of the events and with everything else, is they can see specific warbands that are struggling. Normally those warbands that are struggling, you can kind of tell why, because those particular lists aren't necessarily being built to a super high competitive standard with all of the allies and everything else thrown in, which naturally means that they're a bit weaker. So I think it's a very difficult thing to balance and to get right. Are they a more hindrance than a help? If we're talking about from a list diversity standpoint, then there are basically two schools of thought, right? One is that allies help list diversity because you can bring all of these different fighters and you can mix and match them and you can do basically whatever you like. The other school of thought is that allies stifle diversity because ultimately what you're going to be getting is the same kind of warbands over and over again, just with a different core. So a great example of this is like Fulmroid Crusher, Darangard, and a bunch of chaff. You can have that in any number of warbands. Ultimately, it's the same warband and it plays exactly the same, but on paper, it looks like those different warbands are doing well. The side of the fence that I sit on is more to the side of I like allies because they allow you to take different things, and without that, all of those other warbands that don't necessarily have great options and are being bolstered by allies would essentially go unplayed. And if a warband is going unplayed, then it's very difficult to tell, okay, these are the places where I need to do targeted buffs to those warbands to buff them up. Okay, Blackberry6850 asks, how often in your games a quad on the first and second battle round absolutely dominates the game, especially when your opponent has none? How do you feel about today's state of Rampage, and would you change it or not? Let's handle the second part of this question first. I think today's Rampage is fine. I think the distance that you move according to the distance on the dice is okay. It's still one of the top quads in the game, especially compared to some of the other stuff out there. But I think that's more a function of a lot of the warbands were kind of designed before the Rampage change and before some of this new wave of warbands that we've seen. So yeah, going into the future, I expect to see much better quads. Even if we look at something like the Pyreghiests, for example. Not a super popular warband, but I think their quad is really cool. It's got the pull on it. It does a whole bunch of damage if you run into people. I think it's really fun. And yeah, there are times that you would use that instead of Rampage. So that's kind of a plus, I think. So I find, at least in the games that I play and the warbands that I like to play with, that I'm really building around triples on my guys, right? So, for example, if we take the list that I took to Warhammer World a while back, it had Skavic, it had a whole bunch of people. More often than not, a triple was more valuable to me than a quad. Again, in Nighthaunt, for example, you're looking for those triples because you want to get Resurrect off, you want to get Fretful Touch off, and your quad isn't really super key. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. I find that quads are more dominant kind of in the middle of the game when you're a little bit closer and you can get that big Rampage off. I think that's far more impactful. But yeah, no, early in the game, I find that having triples and doubles are more important to me than those quads. So those are the things that seem to stick out in my mind anyway, that give me the advantage going into the later turns. Stephen Colzer says, can Slaanesh Sybarites be made competitive now? Yes is the answer. There is a Slaanesh good stuff list that is rolling around. It is something to the effect of a Slakehorn or a Lord of Pain or Vassalak, something like that, going along with Slake Slash from the Dread Pageant. So that gives you 2 or 3 very strong attacking pieces to build your army around. And then people are using things like Vexmore and one other member of the Thricefold Discord to round that out. The Fiend Hero is very fast. You can use Divine Blessings now to buff those things up from Strength 3 up to Strength 4. That was kind of the main problem with Slaanesh as it was before, is that when you were attacking, you were sitting at Strength 3, so you were really prone to counter. Divine Blessings kind of change all that and it allows you to do all this stuff. So that's really good. And you can also use things like the Fiend of Slaanesh Hero. You can ally that in if you wanted to. That's a very solid tech piece. It's got a net. It's got a whole bunch of attacks. You can buff it up, so that's really, really good. That gives you a very solid core of heroes that you can play with. And then on top of that, what do you have access to? Blissbrew Homunculus. You can fill out your entire list with the rest of that. So that still allows you to make something like an 8-man list, I would say, with a whole bunch of Homunculus. They form your chaff, and then you've got your big, your heavy, your snippy fighters to do the actual damage there. If you want to bring Symbaresh and Myrmidesh, you still can, but now you have this whole suite of very good Chaos heroes and Chaos allies you can slot into the warband along with your Homunculus to pad out the numbers to make everything work for you. Okay, Blackberry6850 also asks, is there any balanced monster list that isn't broken or complete trash? A list that you could play casually and people would not hate you for it. I think there are monsters that you can play casually. I'm thinking of stuff like the Ale Guzzler Gargant, the really big troll whose name kind of escapes me. I think those are pretty fun. The Mutalic Vortex Beast, the Charybdis, those are all monsters that all basically have a thing in common, and that's that they have to walk to get to their opponent. They can't just leap over things. They can't fly like the Chimera can or the Zombie Dragon can. And suddenly when a monster has to walk, it's a lot less impactful on the battlefield and less impactful during the game, and you can kind of play around it, right? If you know that a monster's coming towards you, it's got 3 activations, but it can only do move and then attack possibly, and then move again, then it's going to use Dragon Maul to hit you. It's a lot easier to manage and to play around just because it's a lot slower and you can't just place it anywhere. So yeah, there was a Ale Guzzler Gargant list that I played at Warhammer World. That was pretty fun to play against, because basically I'd never played a Gargant before. It was kind of brawling a Storm Fiend. The Storm Fiend managed to take it down a lot, and then a bunch of guys managed to kill the Gargant. I think those slower walking monsters are more fair to begin with, and yeah, they do have more play around. So anything with those slower ones, I would say, are kind of fine. They're still super expensive, but they're not as overly oppressive as the Chimera is. Unstable Vampycat asks, any Grand Alliances you think deserve new allies or monsters for Warcry? The Centaurian Marshal is an amazing model and made me realize how my preferred Grand Alliance, Death, has very little choice for larger models. Considering its appearance in the Hollow King novel, I'd love an undead Gargant model for Grand Alliance Death. Okay, so this book is Monstrous Arcanum. It was produced by Forge World, and Forge World at one point for Old Warhammer Fantasy were doing a whole series of really big monsters for all of the different Grand Alliances, and it was really, really cool. And at one point I was basically collecting them, right? So I love the stuff in this book. To give some kind of an example, if we're talking about Grand Alliance Death, we have the Incarnate Elemental of Death here, the double-headed twin worm. We've seen the Incarnate Elemental of Gur, for example. That's super fun. So there are all sorts of things that Games Workshop could go for. The one that sticks out in my mind, we had the Necrofex Colossus, this giant, like, undead boat construct thing that was held together with sinew and bone and all sorts of this stuff, and that was raised by wild necromancers. So that's all like really cool things that you could have. So definitely, yeah, I would go Grand Alliance Death if I had to pick. And of course, not forgetting our favorite, the Khemric Titan, the giant beetle super scarab. So yeah, I think Death definitely needs something. I think Order could do with a whole bunch of different things. They have a lot of different dragons now, and Draculiths and Draconoths and Dracoloids, whatever Games Workshop is calling them nowadays. Just having the Hydra and the Charybdis, which aren't really seen anymore anyway, I think is kind of sad. And of course, there are a whole bunch of kind of medium-sized, I would say, if you're translating it into Warcry, there could be like 300, 350 point fighters that you could potentially put in. I think Games Workshop would have to do a really good job of balancing these things, because when you think about more than 300 points worth of fighter, it's either on the side of War Boss on Great Gnash Tooth, which is basically unplayed, or it's on the other side, which is near to Fomori Crusher style, which would have been played everywhere if we're talking about before April. So yeah, I think Games Workshop need to be careful with it, but I would definitely like to see some at least medium-sized things in there. Things like the Mourngul from Nighthaunt that's just disappeared from the range. That would have been really cool to have as this middling brawler piece in Nighthaunt. I think that would have been really fun also. Young B Frosty says, are we going to have to wait for 3rd edition for stuff like Khorne Daemons to be playable? The answer is probably. At this rate, it looks like we are getting updates maybe once every 6 months, possibly. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see whenever the next one comes out. But at that rate, I think it will take a long time for Games Workshop to get around to fixing all of the different problems and factions in the game. I think Khorne Daemons in particular, you have to really think about what do you want your Khorne Daemons to do and what differentiates them between Slaanesh Demons, for example, or any other of those kind of chaos barbarian marauder types. What do they do that those other factions can't do, and what makes them unique and what makes their playstyle unique? There are many different ways to do this. You could look in abilities, for example. You could have a faction mechanic whereby your abilities get stronger the more guys you killed. If you killed multiple of 8s, then it does all sorts of things. That's always a possibility. But yeah, your basic like Bloodletters, for example, there isn't really anything special about them. They'll do a whole bunch of damage. They're just big buff demons in an entire faction of big buff demons that do choppy things, right? So that's something that I think Games Workshop needs to nail down first. What is Khorne's identity? What are Khorne Daemons specifically identity? And how is that going to translate into Warcry? And I think that's a much bigger update that's needed there, as opposed to something like the Nighthaunt mini update or the points changes to Hunters of Huanchi. Black Reaver asks, Listbuilding for Pyreghiests in casual play, 1 box plus an ally, aiming for Soul Blaze over Pyre tokens. Okay, so Soul Blaze is the triple that your hero gets that if a guy has died during that turn, you get to make a whole bunch of guys activate again. Okay. Is it best to remove 2 Torch Wraiths or 1 Torch Wraith and a Flame Wraith so that I can add an Ascan Exemplar or a Cruel Ghast Cruciator? So Torch Wraiths are your 115 point guys with the ranged attack and also the ability to generate Pyre tokens based off one of their abilities. And then Flame Wraiths are your 100-point guys with the 12 wounds to toughness 4 and just a bunch of 1-3 and 1-4 damage. So what would I replace here? So I don't rate Torch Wraiths super highly. I think you get 3 in a box, if I remember. So I would much prefer to drop 2 Torch Wraiths over something else. Personally, what I was doing, if I wanted to focus on Soul Blaze over Pyre tokens, I'd try and get another Deacon of Flames in there, because suddenly when you have 2 of those, their damage is way higher than anything else that's in the warband. They can both use Soul Blaze, so on that weird, crazy turn where you get a couple of triples, you can get them both to do things. Now, they can't affect themselves, but they can affect other deacons to get them to use their really good damage profile. So that's the first place I would look. And then the question is, Ascan Exemplar or Krulgast Cruciator? The Exemplar is fine, I want to say. If you can get it, I'd go for a Wielder of the Blade, because Wielder of the Blade, you can give +1 attack. Its damage is basically better than the Exemplar, and it's got the Nighthaunt Resurrect, which is really, really good, and it's got a free move, and that's fantastic. If you can't get that, you can always go with a Executioner from Nighthaunt. Basically the exact same stat line as the Wielder of the Blade. You can buff it up. It still has the Resurrect. It doesn't get the move. Alternatively, yeah, I think if you just had those models, I would go with the Cruciator. The Cruciator is actually fairly tanky, right? 25 wounds, which is pretty good. And it can sit 10 inches away, just putting 4-4-1-4 into things all day long. I kind of like that. It allows it to sit back a bit away from the front lines, just throw dice in there and use its resurrect ability. So that's what I would go for if those were my only 2 options. Alternatively, Wielder of the Blade or Decapitator Blessed with +1 attack. Failing all of that, Tongfather, get another one of those in there, and then you'll be able to use that triple more effectively. Gannikari? That's what I'm going with. Gannikari? Yes. Do you have any opinions on why, despite Warcry having its own warbands, the trend, at least according to sites like War Tally, is to play with Age of Sigmar units plus a guest from Underworlds? Shouldn't it be more focused on its own warbands? Sometimes it's hard to sell Warcry because the best units seem to come from Age of Sigmar troops. This is the whole bespoke warband versus Age of Sigmar team argument, kind of which one is better, that kind of thing. Personally, if I were Games Workshop, I would make it so that bespoke warbands were better than Age of Sigmar factions to more encourage people to go and play those factions. I think that one of the big problems actually is the composition of the warband boxes themselves. So you look at things like Krulboy's Monster Killers or Vulcan Flameseekers, the composition of those boxes were really, really good. Hardly any duds in there. You could basically use everything in those boxes and you'd be pretty good to go. But then you see the composition of stuff like the Hunters of Wanchi box, I keep going back to it, and many other boxes where there's 1 or 2 really good fighters that you only actually get 1 of in the box, and suddenly you have to go out and buy multiple boxes to do that. Whereas if you're playing with an Age of Sigmar force, you only need 1 or 2 fighters. Yeah, you might need it over several boxes, but you've got eBay for that. You can go and pick up singles really, really easily. And then on top of that, you're not just locked into whatever faction it is the bespokes are going to give you, which, let's remember, most of them are just chaos factions, and most of them are big buff guys. And that's kind of it. So if you don't like the whole big buff guy aesthetic, there aren't actually a very large amount of warbands for you to play if we're talking about bespokes. Whereas Age of Sigmar, you have access to everything and you can play basically what you want. So I think that's the main problem when we're talking about bespoke warbands versus Age of Sigmar. I wouldn't say that the best builds are just, here's my Age of Sigmar warband plus a whole bunch of Warhammer Underworlds. I think you can make just as good warbands from bespoke plus allies that you can from Age of Sigmar plus allies. If the argument that we're talking about is why aren't bespoke warbands as competitive as Age of Sigmar warbands, I will go back to the thing that I keep on saying about this topic, is that those boxes are basically like starter sets for that faction in Warhammer 40k or in Age of Sigmar or in whatever, in that you cannot expect a basic 1-box bespoke warband to be able to compete with a fully competitive, specially designed Age of Sigmar list. You have to do the same to those bespoke warbands, and yes, they can compete with each other and it's absolutely fine, but it's kind of like expecting, oh, here's my Age of Sigmar Spearhead box to be able to compete with, here's my actual designed 1,000 point Age of Sigmar army. They're kind of not the same. So that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about bespoke warbands versus Age of Sigmar. And that's all I've got time for today. I hope you guys had your questions answered. And if not, you got more questions for me, you can put them down in the comment section below. I will add them and I will get to them in a future episode. As always, if you like what you see, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to give me some more support, you can join me here on YouTube as a member. You can join me over on Patreon. You can join me over on Streamlabs. Either way, you're going to get to see behind the scenes content. You're going to get to see early access, and you're going to get to have a say into the kind of video that I produce in the future. But yes, that's it from me for today. Thank you very much for watching. As always, I've been Itan. This has been Off Meta Musings, and I will see you next time.